Okay, here we go. This is one of I think it's the last piece in the Amplio Foundation set, at least for now. Um, I say for now because I may come up with another one as I tend to do. And this is about using pattern languages. Now, there's no supposition you know what a pattern is or a pattern language is. And actually, I'm pretty pleased with being able to explain things this quickly, and I hope readily, easily. One thing I found that's interesting, and just a side note, is that, and this is why I think it's important to have materials that are mature, have been well defined, is that the more you deliver something, the better you can explain it because the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And when I really learned this was, oh, a long time ago in 99. Actually, I remember the conference where I manifested it was well, I remember where it was. I can't remember what it was called. It was in Munich. And it was a conference of programming, more conference, and a lot of agile in it as well. And I had a little extra time at the end of one of my talks, and somebody asked me to explain the visitor pattern, which is no longer needed because it's integrated into languages. And I knew I couldn't do it in 15 minutes. That just was a mess. It's something I shouldn't have tried. But about a year later, having explained it dozens of times in my workshops, I could explain it in 5 minutes. So there's this thing about always improving how you explain things. That's just a coaching tip. Always look at how people react and you can learn what's misunderstood and what's not misunderstood. Anyway, here we go with the real talk. Using pattern languages to create the big picture. Um, and and what we have had is the Amplify Foundations. We started with systems thinking. We did first principles. I did value stream management months ago, and the recordings are all there on the YouTube playlist, so I'm not doing those again. We did factors for effective value streams. Uh, and these are being put up on the presentations at Success Engineering. I'm going to re-record the first principles. I'll get that done this week because we had kind of changed some things. So this is Christopher Alexander's system design approach, how he designs systems. Okay, and I'll be referring a lot to this book, The Timeless Way of Building. This is my favorite book of his 3 books. This is the one that talks about the theory of patterns. He has another one called The Pattern Language, which is where he describes, I think it's, I don't know how many, a couple hundred, more than that, languages to actually build towns and things like that. And the third book is The Oregon Experiment, where he actually applies it. They actually used it at a university in Oregon. So those are interesting. But if you're going to read one, read The Timeless Way Building. Well, if you're like me and you like to see the big picture and the thought process, pattern language is more popular with people. Anyway, I want to start with 3 problems we have at scale. Okay. One is we need a system view. If you don't have the system view, you do local optimizations. We saw that in the earlier systems thinking approach. Okay. The composition of the system must be based on how different aspects of the system work together. This is, in other words, how they relate to each other, but it also is how the different pieces themselves work. And people need to decide their own way of working. That is, they need their autonomy within the context of the whole. This should be so apparently true, but is not followed in 90% of what's out there in the agile space. See, if you take Scrum and do Scrum at scale and you start with all your teams, you get your agile teams, and then you put them together, then you're saying, oh, I'm using Scrum. Well, maybe that's not the right thing to use across the organization. Some places it's good, some places it's not. I could put Kanban in that statement as well. Maybe Kanban isn't the right place to use every place. Okay. So we have this dilemma of having to have an overall view that isn't telling everybody what to do. And for some reason, well, I know why. See, the Agile Manifesto was an overreaction to process being imposed. So I want to be very clear here. What I'm talking about is this overall view is not imposing process. It's imposing the context within which you work. In other words, if you're working at a company that builds software, you shouldn't be trying to sell furniture on the side. That's not what they're up to. They have a right to say that. If you're in a regulated environment, it's okay. It's important. It's critical to say you have to follow these regulations or we get we go out of business. Context is created by certain things that are beyond just somebody's opinion. So I'm not talking about process like telling people what to do. I'm talking about constraints that are truly on the organization you must pay attention to. Okay, now there's an interesting relationship between Chris Alexander's stuff, which I've not talked about, coupled with Russ Akoff's view that I have talked about. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to review Russ Akoff's stuff a little bit here because it's important. And basically, he talks about we need to look at the relationships between the components of an organization because that's how systems are defined. Okay, this entails what their responsibilities are, how they relate to other components, how they fit into the organization. And we use the model of a car, like how do the wheels get on the axles? How does the steering wheel work? How does all those pieces work? When you don't have all the, if you have the pieces and get the best pieces, but they don't work together, you have a pile of junk. So systems are defined by the relationships. Okay. Now, there are three ways I've seen to define systems. Decompose into component parts. This is what's called reductionism. In other words, this kind of SAFE's approach. They got all this stuff. You look at the big picture and you see, I don't know how many things, but you see a lot of things. The overall picture of how they work together is not clear. You see the pieces. There's value in seeing the pieces, by the way, because you get to see where people are. In fact, one of the things that's nice about SAFE and why it's not effective, but why its sales is effective, is you look at that big picture and you say, oh, there I am. That's where I fit. The problem is how you work with everybody else is not clear. You don't get a cohesive result. It appears complicated because it is complicated. There's no easy way to look at the whole thing, but it does have this appeal that everybody has a place. That feels good. You're not losing your job because we're going to Agile. By the way, I've heard this said for like a decade now. I mean, a decade ago, I remember at some presentation and somebody who had used it, like I don't know if it was Intel or somebody, he had left the company. He thought SAFE was a disaster, but he was looking up at that picture and he says they bought it because managers can see where they had a role. Now, there's another way to go, compose from existing pieces. Ironically, Dean Leffingwell seems to be playing both sides sometimes because he says you can't get agile at scale unless you got agile teams. So what if you start with agile teams? So he kind of had this idea, you got to get the teams and then you put them all together, but then he has different ideas and components. But Scrum at scale is scaling Scrum is this idea. Oh yeah, we're going to use Scrum and every team's going to use Scrum. And then we're going to see how the teams fit together. But not everything is the same. See, this is the weird thing to me. See, this is imposition. To say everybody's doing Scrum, yeah, you get variations in it, or everybody's doing Kanban, yeah, you have variations in it. But that's imposing. How do you know those are the right approaches? Yes, I know Scrum and I know Kanban. I had formed Lean Kanban University with David Anderson, so I've used it now 16 years. Scrum and Kanban, though, are still particular manifestations of certain principles. They're not generic, actually. Systems thinking tells us we must build things in the context of the whole. This gives us our third approach. Decompose elements that are defined by the responsibilities and how they communicate to each other. This is Alexander's approach. It's a patterns approach because these things will be configurable elements we'll discover. And then basically we can take these patterns and create the context and put them in the approach we want. So this is a different way of doing it. I'll give you a contrast. I could have a picture, but I don't, but you do it in your own mind. Have you ever seen a picture? Mostly I've seen this in the United States, but I'm sure it's in some new developments in other countries where all the houses are kind of like cookie cutter houses. I mean, they may have different paint colors. They may have slight variations, but you go into the development and it just looks like, man, they just reproduce everything the same. Maybe there are 3 or 4 variations, like they can flip it so it looks a little different. I remember living in a development where we had a design of one house and right next to us was the exact same house, except it was flipped. It's just, they just put the same pieces together in the opposite order. And who cares if you walk right or left when you walk in, everything's the same. That doesn't feel so great, does it? I mean, it's kind of cheaper. but it's not nice. Now imagine like a Swiss village. I don't know why Swiss village comes to my mind. And like the old ones, or actually the Italian villages that are on the cliffs. They're just like everything's different, but it's amazingly beautiful, right? And the reason is when those were built, every little thing was built in the context of what was next to it. It wasn't preformed. Now, we're not building buildings, so take that loosely, but I wanted to give you an example of how a Lego block system is quite different than custom. The problem is you can't get everything custom if you're not talking to each other. So this is an issue. So in the book of pattern language here, this is the second book, or I think it was the second book anyway I read. He suggests design is often thought of as a process of synthesis, a process of putting things together, a process of combination. According to this view, a whole is created by putting together parts. The parts come first and the form of the whole comes second. This is what Akoff was talking about when he said take the parts of a car and put them together without paying attention to the relationship. Now, it's funny. I read this like almost 30 years ago, and I could still remember when he says this next word, but I didn't even get past the but, and I knew he was going to tell me I'm wrong. It's impossible to form anything which has the character of nature by adding preformed parts. Now, he's trying to create what he calls the character of nature, how we live. So I was a heavy developer when I read this book. And I remember to me, that's object-oriented programming. You get this object, this object, this object, you get them to work together. And when I saw the but, I said, oh, that's how I do it with these first two lines, but I'm wrong. Oh, what are you going to tell me? When parts are modular, made before the whole, by definition, because they've already been made, it's impossible for every part to be unique according to its position in the whole. Now, why do we need it unique? Well, maybe they don't all need to be unique, but they can't all be the same. If you have 100 teams, do you really think every one of those should be working exactly the same? Probably not. In fact, I would suggest that most teams don't even work the same themselves over time. They build a new product and they get into a maintenance mode, then they get extensions. This deciding on frameworks is an issue, but it solves a problem. People need to know what they're doing. So I'm not saying frameworks are, well, I actually do think frameworks are inherently bad, but I'm not saying that they don't fill a purpose. They just don't fulfill the purpose well. And I think the next topic I'm going to talk about is how you can use what I'm talking about today to do that well. Okay. It's only a way to make a place which is alive. Here's where you got to translate it. He's talking about towns and homes, and we're talking about good agreements. Actually, in software, it could have been alive. Yeah, just a second, Karen. It could have been alive, meaning the code worked well. Here it means that people relate to each other. Yeah, Karen, what's your question?
Well, when you're discussing when parts are modular and made before the whole, what came to my mind is, the Medicaid, the big systems, they're all going to modular parts of the system. So is that are you also referring to that, or is that something different?
No, what I mean is let's look at ops. Okay. So, and I'll give some other examples later, but that's a great question. So let's look at ops. Like I might have a big company and I might have 5 different teams, 5 different ops teams. In fact, I've worked in companies that are that large where the operations group is 30, 40 people, even bigger actually. But I was working with 30 or 40 people for one particular train involved. They had 125 people all told. Now, these op teams did different things. Some were setting up equipment, some were helping with deployment, some were relating to databases. So would we want, before we combine things, say, well, this is how ops is going to work. This is how this ops team is going to work. This is how that ops team is going to work. That's what I mean by having come up with it ahead of time. You cannot do that. You cannot predefine. You cannot make them modular. You cannot make them plug and play, because they have different needs and they work with different teams. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what
right. So the modules they're talking about in, say, Medicaid is different.
Well, yeah, well, I don't want to get into Medicaid because that's a political thing and there could be a lot of conversation, but The different needs of people could be different. Uh, the different ways you administer it could be different. Uh, in our world, the differences again could be also how does documentation do? I could have this whole group that does documentation, but maybe this product is used more online. Maybe this product is used more where it's mobile, so they need more mobile type things. So it's like you can't take the same. This is the issue. You cannot predefine your groups and put them together and expect to get a decent result. And that could be any group. Pick any group. Even how do you do requirements? How do you do development? Would a development team that's building a new product work the same as a development team that's working on a legacy system? Probably not. Would they relate to people specifically the same way? Probably not. Okay. In short, each part is given its specific form. In other words, how it works with everybody else, how they're organized by its existence in the context of the larger whole. Let me give a different example. Let's say I'm a maintenance group. I'm a maintenance group of a new product and we haven't tested it as well as we should, or maybe we have tested it as well as we should, but we have education involved. So we want to go out there and we want to expect, man, we're gonna have quick response for people because we expect they're gonna have some questions on how to use this product. Versus a help group that might have a long-standing product that's worked well and that people know how to use. You see how you might do support differently in those two situations? So saying, well, everybody's going to be, this is how you do support. See, we're actually coming up against that issue of why we don't want imposed process. Because in a weird way, imposed process says predefined, this is how teams work. You're telling people how to work without attending to where they fit in the organization. He's actually never quite got that point. He's actually saying why global how to do work doesn't work, because how to do it is going to vary according to the context. Okay. Now, don't worry about the differentiating process, but what he means by that is we're splitting it up and looking at different things. So coming back to looking at the system as relationships. In other words, the system is about the relationships between the components, not the components themselves. The components are important, but the way the system is defined is about the relationships. So if we look at the relationships, that creates a context. But what if the pieces are defined first? In other words, we come up with all the teams, then we're kind of constraining how the relationships work. There's no universal, and it's not going to work well. The relationships between this and this, where they were predefined, will not work well across the organization. Everything's going to be different, and everything is now going to be a conversation about how we should be doing things. So the idea is relationships create the context. Teams must fit into the global picture, but they can implement the responsibility and how it best fits them. This is a simple idea, actually, but it's the inverse of how we normally design. And we're taught this. It's interesting. As kids, how do we create? We use building blocks. We use Legos. We have everything interchangeable. That's interesting. There's something I have 6 grandkids, so I've been watching kids play. I play with them and things like that. And I'm actually getting insights in this talk I never really thought about. My kids like Lego blocks, but you know what they really like? They like those specialized Lego blocks where they get to build like a starship or something. Those parts aren't all the same. They've actually been predefined actually to fit in. I mean, they were designed with a hole in mind. Oh, we're going to build a starship. So we have to overcome this idea that modularity, although it's easier to manage. See, there's this other force here. It's easier to manage as a manager, as an executive, to set up the modular pieces. So we tend to go that way. It's kind of why SAFe is easier to do. It's got all these pieces, but it's not the right way to think about it. So here's an example. I wanted to give a few examples of this. Let's say we need people to work in a common cadence. In large companies, this is really important. In other words, say every 2 weeks, we want to be able to integrate together and see if what we're building. Does that make sense? We might have 6, 7 teams involved, but we need to get everything integrated so we can demonstrate. They need to do 2 things. One is you need to demonstrate it to the customer, but we need to have all the teams talking to each other. or we need to have ops talking to get ready for deployment. So if we say we have a cadence, so a cadence is a common thing. We're going to have all our pieces on 2-week sprints. Excuse me, not 2-week sprints, because that would be an implementation issue. But every 2 weeks, we're going to get together and see what we do, how we're doing. I can still have my teams work on Scrum or Kanban. I remember doing this. My last project at the PMI was this. We were building an online, a self-study program for value stream management. And we were actually building the requirements and the skeleton shell of what needed to be taught. And the group, we weren't actually making the final stuff. Some other group was, some experts in, how to build online stuff. And they wanted us to give them something every week. So that was imposed on us. We had to give them something every week. That was the contract. Did they tell us how to work? No, I don't think I had agreed to it, actually. They didn't tell us how to work. They just told us how we had to interact with them. And that was the way it was. What we did internally was kind of the way Amplio works. It's just mostly was we followed principles. We knew we had to get something by the end of the week, but we wouldn't have a week. We had a week goal, but it wasn't for a week. It was within the week. We'd usually finish 3-4 days into the week. That'd get us a day extra to carry over. In other words, we'd achieve our goal. We were focused on the goal of the increment of value. We'd get that done in sometimes 3 or 4 days, which was good because then we get started on the next week in case we ran into problems. We didn't throw that away. Sometimes when you have a sprint, you tend to fill up what you're working on for that sprint, and you could have gotten it done faster. So that was an example of everybody aligning around the same cadence. Okay, one last thing on cadence. One of the cool things is Kanban does this, by the way. Kanban can have and should, actually, Carl Scotland was, as I recollect, the first person who talked around this around 2009, that even if Kanban was a flow system, you had cadence to communicate with others. In other words, every week, every other week, whatever it is, I'm going to talk to my customers. I'm going to talk to my product managers. I'm going to talk to ops. I'm going to coordinate with the cadence. It's like a metronome, boom, 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 boom. But inside that, I'm flow. And that's what's really useful. Okay. What about others to release? I'm not one team. I got to coordinate with other teams. So every couple of weeks, I don't care if that team's doing Kanban. I don't care if that team's doing Scrum. They just have to release at the same time. By the way, this is how Toyota does it. I remember going to a conference in Paris. I can't remember when it was. A long time ago, I don't know. At least a decade ago. And the CIO, I guess, of Toyota was there. Yeah, man, he talked about how they did things. And Toyota's got this reputation for being horrible with IT and all that. And I don't know particularly about IT, but what I do know is how they build their products, because he talked about this. And what he had is cars are complicated. Okay. And what they had set up was you have all these different units, like the transmission, the engine, the frame, all that. And he said they had dates at which you had to be ready. They didn't care how you worked to get ready, but if you weren't ready by that date, it was trouble. Okay. And they did that, and people knew they did that. Now, what Toyota did internally to those, he didn't actually even talk about much. He was talking about this bigger picture. We need to make sure the engine and the and the powertrain that it drives are working together. Now, it didn't mean these people were totally separate and not talking to each other, but it was like, here are dates, you have to come up to it. And you had to coordinate at different times. And I'm pretty sure they probably had weekly or whatever coordinations as well. Consider those building new products versus those extending existing ones. This is what I want you to think about, though. Do you actually coordinate exactly the same way? Probably not. See, a new product, when you're building a new product, like using MVPs a la Eric Ries, how you get it out the door, who you have to talk to is going to be quite different than how you would go if you're in a massive program that is already out there and lots of people. Then you got to talk to everybody. See, the interesting thing about MVPs is you don't actually work exactly the same way. You get the same conceptual requirements. So I got to talk to ops, I got to get it out on things, but you may not implement it the same way. So we have the same system, but now we have this set of agreements for release. So what I want you to, what I'm trying to point out is I have the system, and there's could be some set of rules for cadence, some set of rules for how we do these products, and then people implement differently according to the type of product they have. Governance, again, different teams may meet to follow it differently. I remember SOX compliance was an interesting thing back 20 years ago when it first started coming into existence. There's an intention of the SOX compliance, but how you actually implement it and manifest it might be different. But it's the end result is what's important. Internal tools of a team may not match the external teams that they have to report to. I've known teams that they track things like manually inside their system, but then they would put it into the system that management wanted. That was a little overhead, but they weren't using the management system for themselves. They were using it for management. Management wanted to see what was going on. The way you don't impose things on people is you have a well-defined way of talking to everybody you're working with. That creates the context here. Okay. So, and I'm going to say one last thing, and then I'm going to pause for some questions on this. So there's another thing that's important here that I guess is not just Akoff or Alexander, but comes from, I'll talk about that you need explicit workflow. Comes from a lot from Lean and Kanban. See, there's another reason to have these agreed upon relationships. This is something we talk about. I just published, it's on LeanPub now. Being an effective value coach, leading by creating value by myself and Paula Stewart. And this is something we talk about in that book is people don't listen to each other. You're not listening to me, by the way. You think you are. You're hearing my words, but that's not listening to me. You're listening to something else. And it's important to know this. See, you have somebody here, they're thinking something, and then they say something, and then it goes over and they hear something. But then what they hear and what's in their head are two different things. This is what's called listening. This is what's called their listening, not of action, but a verb, but a noun. Now, if you just had the thought, what the hell is he talking about? That's what I'm talking about. What's he talking about? I'm confused. Or do you ever get the running commentary? Oh, this guy's full of stuff. Oh, this doesn't make any sense. Oh, wow, that is so cool. That's what I'm talking about. He didn't say that. Do you ever notice how much of your conversation is not what you're hearing at all, but is what you're hearing in your head? I mean, it's not what they said, but it's in your head. This is called listening. Now, when you get to be there's a way to not, what's cool is when this person can listen to that. Now, they can't really listen to that, but there are clues. I saw some people back in the 80s who you swore the way they talked, you swore they were listening to this guy. Then they weren't. What they did is they pay attention to why would somebody say something like that? You can often kind of get clues and you can ask them, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is this mechanics happens. These are not the same. There's this ongoing story about user stories that, in fact, this is what inspired it about why user stories and all this. And the problem is a user story, does that sound like it's something about a user? I mean, might you get that idea that it's about a user, but you know what? User stories don't you not just have just users. So people use user stories for other things, and then they wonder why they're confused. Because this person is hearing, hey, they're talking about a user story. They must be talking about users. The point is there's confusion when you do it this way. So the relationships are important because we can make these explicit, not to follow, but explicit. And here's what we mean. Notice the number of relationships are not as many as the number of possible, not actually implemented, the number of possible implementations. This makes things simpler as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause at this point for questions. I'll leave this picture up. Or are we good?
Just wanted to add the fact that the more people you are passing that information to, it gets filtered by each one of them.
Oh my goodness.
So by the time you get to the next one, it's exponential.
Yeah, it's the telephone game. You know, put three or four, put some people off to the right of the screen. It's a disaster.
Yeah.
It's a disaster. So this idea that you don't have explicit workflow, which is still not accepted, this is one of the biggest differences between Scrum and Kanban mindset. See, it's really weird. People talk about the agile as a mindset, but then when it comes to defending Scrum or defending Kanban, what they do is they then forget the mindset. One of the mindsets of Kanban is you have explicit workflows so people know how they're working together. Yeah, Karen.
So a couple slides ago, you said you have a well-defined way of talking. Could you explain that?
You don't have a well-defined way of talking. You have a well-defined set of agreements. And how you do that is up to you. If you're in a really large company, I would probably write them down quickly. I'd put them on Kanban boards. Sometimes I've had people make these really big boards that represent the way the whole organization works, and you use what's called a visual control. So let me explain two terms here that are very important. I think it was Alistair Coburn who first started talking about information radiators. So in information radiators, I have a team that's doing stuff and they want to explain to others what's going on. So they have all the things that are being worked on listed. If you go to an airport, if you look at the incoming and the outcoming arrivals, departures, that's an information radiator. You can see what's coming in, what's going out. You cannot see what's going on with any, you just get the data. Now, Lean has a different way of working. And Kanban should do this. Not everybody stresses this enough, but this is a big difference in, say, Scrum and Kanban. Scrum just shows you where the work is, but it's not explaining how on the board it's being done. Kanban, you should, or you're not really doing it well. So you have what's called explicitly documenting what the workflow is. And now you have what's called a visual control. See, now this is not telling you what to do. This is, a lot of people misinterpret this. It's not, oh, I got enough all the board. Oh, this is against the first principles of the manifesto and all that, which, by the way, I think is wrong anyway. It's not people over process. Those two work together. Don Reinertson says it should be people times process. They should be working together. Yes, you don't impose process. You don't follow it, but it should be how people agree to work, and you make that explicit. And that's what I mean by the explicit workflow. And that can vary. In a team, the explicit workflow within the team is usually represented on the board. It's got a few rules. People talk about it. You can change it anytime you want to. The power of this is it makes how people are working visible to management. Now, I'm talking about good management here. The problem with a lot of the bad management that's out in the agile space is most agile management workshops tell managers how to listen to their teams. That's not what they should be doing. Yes, managers should not be managing people, but they need to be managing the relationships between the groups. They need to be managing the structure of the groups. In fact, this is kind of interesting because I hadn't quite thought about it this way. I mean, not in this talk, but I should. How is these relationships described? Do you want everybody on this team and everybody on this team talking about that relationship? Maybe, but maybe not, because to do it across the organization is just too much for everybody involved. I'm sorry, it's not that way. You don't tell people how to implement the relationships. I have a set of case studies. I'll put in when I put the talk up, I'll put a note to look. These case studies had dramatic improvement. In fact, I'll see if I can pull up the slide that I've got with it, because the improvement here, I'll pull this up right here. These are pretty dramatic improvements in these 4 case studies. The investment was less than $20,000 and they saved $1.7 million. They said, what's the 25% of a 175 person dev group worth? What's 20% of a 100-person dev group? This was a company with 300 or 400 people in IT, and nobody had a clue what was going on. It was hard to put a number on it, but it was huge. Now, here's what's interesting. I'm not saying I walked on water. I might have these 4 times. I've got some others, but I don't do this all the time. I wish. In each of these cases, they were doing something clearly wrong that the foundations I've talked about earlier let me know. But here's what's really interesting about this. Every one of these cases was solved by management. Every one. In fact, when I list my top 10, every one of my top 10 were solved by management. Every one. Why? Because getting a team to work is not hard. I'm sorry. When you put Scrum, I've been saying this since I did it. If you put Scrum where it's designed cross-functional, I'm building a new product, and my team knows how to build small things or can learn how quickly. It takes an hour to do Scrum. The reason it takes more than that to learn it is because you're putting a square peg in a round hole. But anyway, I got a little off there, but this is actually important to see. Management is to be involved in this. It's not the 20 here or the 10 here or whatever, the 10 here. It's this to this. You've got to create this big picture. But you're not imposing how they do the work. Is that clear? I want to keep making this distinction. We're imposing a structure, so to speak, but we're not really imposing a structure. Why? Because these relationships here have to include talking to the people here, and you get back and forth. If the team say, well, that doesn't work because, and oh, okay, well, I'm sorry, I misjudged it. Or get a team lead involved. That's what I like to do, is have managers and team leads involved, so they represent things. Okay. Okay, so let's go to the last piece of this. We still got to know, how do we do this? This sounds great, putting the whole big together. But we're going to talk about the pattern as a set of configurable elements, okay? In other words, they're like building blocks, except we don't want to think about them as building blocks because those are kind of set. These are flexible things, so we call them configurable elements, both in implementation and how they relate to each other. Now, they're called solutions to recurring problems in a context. This comes from the Timeless Way building. I've got a pattern language up there. Who knows why? But I think it's because I actually took this definition from this book. He has a lot of overlap. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way you can use the solution a million times. In other words, conceptually, I'm doing the same thing, but you never implement it the same way. In other words, you don't force the team structure. You don't force the cadence. You don't force, whether it's a sprint or time boxing or something like that. What you're doing is, I have this problem, I have this context, and he talks about the forces in that context. In other words, you have to have a name. So a pattern, the way patterns actually also get defined differently for different domains, it turns out. By domains, I don't mean like I'm solving finance or I'm doing healthcare. What I mean is, am I doing product development versus am I building towns versus am I writing software? And this is how I thought about it. You've got a name. What's the intention? What's the problem you're solving? There are a lot of different solutions. How do you relate to other patterns, and what are the forces you need to do? So it provides a solution to a problem by attending to the context the problem is showing up in. Now, this is kind of interesting. If you look at the Scrum Guide and you read about every role, event, artifact, or rule that's in the Scrum Guide, you can start thinking about it differently. So it's got sprints. Well, what's the intention of the sprint? See, the sprint is an implementation. See, a sprint is here. The real thing is you're trying to solve the problem of planning. You're trying to solve the problem of being able to talk to other people. Do you get that distinction? Scrum is a set of, there's some flexibility in the solution, but they put constraints on it. Now, that's fine, because at first it seems to make things simpler. But what's not simple is when it doesn't fit. So it's simple to understand and necessarily difficult to master. The implication is, well, product development is difficult. Well, yeah, but that's figuring out what they need. The mechanics should be simple and simple to use. So we have a name, we have an intention, like what does this thing do? Intentions, what are the forces? Like if I'm doing sprint planning or something, who do I have to relate to? How many customers do I have? Do I have a customer who actually sits with a team like they do in XP, hopefully? Do you get how that might change the cadence? If you have 1,000 customers versus if you've got one customer and they sit with a team, and anything in between? Or how big your team is, or how many other teams you have to work with? Then how many implementations are, how many other related patterns, because they sometimes relate to each other. For example, one of the patterns in one of the patterns in a pattern language is he talks about porches. Porches are often connected to houses. I'm being a little funny because that's what a porch is. But porches are often facing, say, courtyards. So you have a courtyard pattern, a porch pattern, a house structure on how to enter it. And when you put all these together, you can solve the problem in a very elegant way. And going back to management for a second, that I realize I forgot to say when we're talking about these different issues. See, if you have this explicit workflow based on these are the best ways to solve these issues, what happens when somebody looks at it and says, well, this isn't the best way? Now, what they could do is, what often happens is they just break the rules. Now, that's not necessarily bad. But if they do it without thinking or without agreement, it could be. But notice a manager can now ask why, or it's not a manager, a scrum master, a team lead, anybody could ask, why did you break the rule? Not like, why did you break the rule? But, you know, I assume there was a reason. Could you tell me? Maybe we need to change the rule. Maybe you got a better idea. See, having these agreements, having these forces and context creates an opportunity to create a better way instead of just insisting on doing it this way because that's what somebody said. Is that clear? This is kind of a sophisticated approach. Now, what I'm not doing today, I might mention it in 2 sentences, but I think next week I'm going to show you how you can make this what looks complex simpler than Scrum to implement, because I've done it. It's not a hypothetical. Okay, potential implementations plus their risk. So a pattern language, I just want to be clear what a pattern language is. It's a set of systems, a set of these relationships, and a set of the patterns that we come up with. Where each pattern, we've said this before, you know, it can implement its own way, like a planning. So like planning, there's a planning pattern. There's a, there would be a product management pattern. And the whole system, each of the pieces becomes a way to work on it. Okay, they provide a way to implement it. Okay. Now, what's interesting, and I've alluded to this, but I just got to throw this in. I love this book, and one of the things I love about this book is if I opened up to page 545, it's funny, I'm not one of these people who can quote where things are by having read it, but I know this one because right here it says at this final stage, the patterns are no longer important. And the reason is the patterns themselves aren't important. What's important are the relationships, the forces, the issues that the patterns talk about. In other words, come back to here. See, it's this context, and this is what's important. This is how it fits into the whole. This is a different way of viewing the world, and it's very powerful. Okay, and this is what systems thinking is telling us. So they're more about structure. They're useful, but how does everybody work together? See, this is the problem. Scrum talks about how you work individually. SAFe gives you this overarching structure that's just predefined. It's either predefined at the team or predefined at the organization. Neither work well. Remember that very first slide I talked about? 3 ways of doing it. Talk about how you can look at how things work together. That's what's important. So the Amplio is comprised of 2 pattern languages and the GPS. There's a pattern language for the overall system. This is something we discovered. When I say we, I mean in net objectives. We discovered around 2007, I think it was, that across organizations, even though they were different, there were only, there's a lot. At that time, I think we had 30 or 40. Now it's up to 40 or 50, but more or less than 50 things that more or less people have to do. Like, how do you create visibility? How do you work with DevOps? How do you do planning, product management? There are about 50 things. And there's another one for teams, smaller, fewer, about 30. Scrum's got about 15 or 18, I think, but they're more. They leave out that they shouldn't leave out. Then there's a GPS to figure out where you are so you can diagnose where you are and create an improvement path. How to convey ideas to people, and then a lot of other things. Okay. I want to actually show a slide. I'm going to leave this up. This is contact information. I'm pausing for questions. And I want to show something, just so ask away. We have, believe it or not, 14 minutes. For me, that's breakthrough, especially because I answered a lot of questions already. But go ahead and ask. And while you're doing it, I'm going to show up something else. or I cannot have been this clear, not first time. I'll show you what I'm pulling up here. Okay, you guys are waiting, so I'll do this first. So one of the things about the Amplio GPS is one of the ways we do it is we represent it. I'm not going to try to explain this fully. I just want to see we represent it as that there's a focus on success, strategy. See, each of these are different parts of the system. And you could just look here and you could see how I have many things. Each of these is done as a pattern. How do you plan? How do you do classes of service? How do you do MVI, minimum viable increments? I'm not going to go explain this, but this is like our equivalent of SAFE's big picture, or think of SAFE's big picture. Why not? Think of their big picture. Oops. There we go. Think of their big picture. What if each of these here, this is the wrong layout, but what if each of these was a pattern? What if you could have different ways of doing it? It still wouldn't be good because it was designed from the pieces. But you're getting a little sense. Okay, so I'm going to just shut up for a little bit so to encourage you all to questions.
I'm really in the middle of the mud, working with a lot of organizations that, yeah, individually, even at the highest level, yeah, this is it. This is so natural. I think that what you're doing with success engineering is about as easy and as natural to get once you get out of your own way and realize how this just flows. This is like, listen, I'm in the country now. Farmers do this. And they didn't have to, they never got any training or anything. This is how you work in an ecocentric environment.
Yeah.
Growing
it really
food is a whole system way of doing things.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a whole systems approach, and it takes a little more thinking. There is a conflation of things in the space, an agile space, and it drives me nuts. Simplicity did not mean your system is as simple as possible. Like having super simple, like a Model T. Think of Model T, for example. Is a Model T simpler than a Tesla? Absolutely. There's not much to it. You can build it yourself. Which is easier to drive? I'm sorry, the Tesla is a lot easier to drive than a Model T. By the way, Model Ts were affordable not because they didn't need mechanics, but because you could be the mechanic. They broke down all the time. So there's this, I build something simple, it's going to be hard to use. Or I build something sophisticated or based on sophisticated thought process, which, Bill, as you're pointing out, is actually natural if we stop and think about it.
Yeah.
So here's another thing. This lets us use our past experience because we have this systems thinking as kind of a model of understanding. This model of understanding that Amplio is based on enables people to use their past experience. Somebody goes from one type of farming into another type of farming. It's a great example. And they don't have to learn farming over. Oh, I've never done this kind of crop. Oh man, it's going to take me years. No, they understand nutrients. They understand growing plants. They understand you don't put a seed right next to another seed, not paying attention to how the plants are going to grow. And don't tell me gardening. I'm a pretty avid gardener now. I love gardening. And part of what I love about gardening is it's a multidimensional problem. It's over time, how you start, height, color, invasiveness. I mean, it's so complicated. And I apply simple rules because I do it for fun. I'm not a professional gardener. And my gardens, I have a lot of flowers and things, and people love it. And it's kind of haphazard. Why? It's haphazard overall because I didn't design anything like, oh, here's what the master garden is going to look like. What I did is anytime I put something in, I just paid attention to what it was next to. I don't, things like that. You can use what you've learned before. Yeah, Tony.
I like your garden analogy, and as a gardener myself, and you wouldn't know it because right now the garden looks terrible, but there is something else which I think you and everyone else will appreciate, and that is over time, as you have worked with your garden, you may begin to notice, depending on your style of gardening, relationships between the organisms, between plants and insects, and how you see their relationships are almost like contracts, the way they deal with one another. It's kind of a subtle, nuanced thing, which I think is fascinating. And I think that's also true in the systems thinking that you are presenting in organizations. I think there could be a similar analogy.
There is. I'm so glad you brought this up because I'll tell you what the analogy is. And I don't have a slide here on it, but think about how many possible solutions there are in an organization. There must be thousands. So it's overwhelming, isn't it? That's just like, oh. So if what you're trying to do is give the right information at the right time to the right people, you can't do it from solutions. So what people tend to do is do something like Scrum. Well, let's just have a few things. Just do these things and then you figure out the implementations. But then what happens? Then what happens is people have to reinvent stuff because they've never been taught it, because there's no way to get at those implementations because there are thousands of them. On the other hand, how many different problems are there? I already told you there are 50 at the organization level and 30 at the team level. That's 80. That's a lot. But they're not all equal. At the organization, at the organization level, I'll just throw this back up here. There are about 50 here, but you don't need to do all 50. Our experience has shown that these 7 or 8 things are the critical ones. So when we talk about creating an improvement path, we talk about what typically is causing the biggest problem. These impact other things. Do I have an intake process? Am I planning right? To coordinate, do I create alignment? Am I working on the right pieces? So my point is, coming back to this, is I have thousands of potential implementations, but I only have about 80 patterns to deal with. And the 80 patterns don't have to be fully understood. I got 10 different ways of doing planning. I don't teach people 10 different ways of doing planning. I interact with them. I don't tell them what's best. I have us together figure out what the best implementation of that pattern is. So they start with something tailor fit. Not everybody needs to know how to do that. This is what I teach in the ACE program, by the way. I teach consultants how to do this. It's not that hard. Why? Because everything's explained in terms of the pattern. It tells you what the forces are, or wherever that was. So here's the other thing. The reason this fits what you just said, Tony, the key to Amplio, this is what's driven me with Amplio. I've done consulting for 25 years, and there's a huge amount I've learned over this 25 years, and I have access to it because I've been doing it for so long. But I'm convinced that the key to success is the right information at the right time with the right people, and make that simple. And it's doable. Look at Wikipedia. You could double the number of pages on Wikipedia. It wouldn't make it any more complicated. See, because when you use Wikipedia, you start seeing the structure they have to it, and you start learning what to look for. And it's not the number of things. And if you're interested in World War II, you can look at it as a start and read a page and say, no, I'm not interested. Or you could just go down to everywhere and learn and spend a year in the thing. And then another year, because they will have discovered more stuff to write. You never get out of it, but you get to pick. So this is how the Amplio system is designed as a set of patterns. And what happens is, as you go and learn more, you start seeing things. I'll give you another analogy. So I've gotten into baking sourdough bread recently. I'm diabetic, and sourdough bread is better on my body, and I like bread. Okay. Well, when I first started doing sourdough bread, I have a friend who helped me out, and he gave me the starter because it just seemed overwhelming. It turns out it's not overwhelming at all, but it felt overwhelming. So thank you giving me the starter. And the first time I used the recipe of the best place, supposedly, and it's like 13 steps. And I'm going through this and I'm on step 8. And I think to myself, they left step 14 off, which is abandon this whole crap because there's no way I'm going to get through this and make a decent loaf of bread. And the only reason I kept at it is because I had my friend and I leaned on him. to ask him, and he said, yeah, it's, so I went to there was an easier way of baking it's the same steps, but the guys, they're meticulous and it's like primo bakery. And this other guy is more interested in being simple. So I followed his process and it was pretty good. It was and now I've done it now 5 or 6 times, and my wife and I like it better than any sourdough bread we've had. And I'm not saying I make it better than anybody else. Absolutely not true. I get ideas from watching others, but here's what I noticed is at first I just wanted to get the damn thing baked. I was surprised it tasted good, actually. Then I wanted to make it taste a little better. And then I started noticing things like texture inside and texture outside. And I started learning more when I could handle learning more because I had this foundation of learning already. So see, patterns give us the structure. I can keep adding stuff here and adding stuff here, and I can notice new forces. It gives a way of storing information and retrieving the information in a direct way that doesn't overload people. That's what's needed in this world, I think, because we are basically, in my opinion, is most companies are like driving on the wrong side of the road backwards, complaining how hard it is because they don't have the right information, or they weren't told because they were said purposely incomplete, and you got to follow these rules. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you follow Dan Kenneman. Dan, it's all about system 1, system 2, dealing with people, how we think, how we act, what we do. System 2, we all could be in system 2, not all the time, otherwise we burn out. But system 1 is basically just playing to, shortcuts. Yeah.
Yeah.
The simpler you make it, the more you can back it up and humanize it, the better results you're going to get. And that means all this stuff, like I love that graph you got with all the stuff that you have out there, but as you put it to context, then all of a sudden you're removing a lot of cognitive load, which
That's
is
right.
why you screw up. And you go to all these Scrum teams out there with the pressure to deliver something that, no, they planned it. No, you can only predict, folks, not plan, because stuff happens. So remove all that's all that kind of stuff that you speak to. And that's what simplicity, context, here's how you address it. And the fact that we're dealing with people.
Yeah. 2 things here, and then I think I'll wrap it up because we're at time. One is that you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but there is part of what you can predict. If you violate first principles, as we talked before, bad things are going to happen. So at least handle what you can predict. But the other thing is, this is the trap we run into, is when you say something's immutable, then that implies you're not going to question if it's valid or not. Because if you're doing Scrum, this is one of my biggest, I think, just ridiculous. If you've been told to do Scrum and you've been hired to be a Scrum Master, the last thing you want to do is tell them, oh, I don't think we should be doing Scrum. I've lost many contracts trying to convince people they shouldn't be doing what they shouldn't be doing. But the people who were there said, no, our manager said we got to do this, so we're going to do this. And I realized later that I was being, I should have just walked away sooner.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, mute yourself. Yeah. So the thing was that I actually had the people who were telling me they had to do Scrum convinced they should, but then they had to go to their manager and convince him, and that wasn't going to happen. So when you get hired in as a Scrum Master and you realize that they shouldn't be doing Scrum, what are you going to do? You're going to fight, tell your manager you're wrong, or I'm here because I'm a Scrum Master. I don't have qualifications, or even if I do, that's not why they hired me. So this idea of immutability, this idea of having to follow things, is deadly. And it's why we're running into problems. We're running into problems because we've taken team processes and spread it. This is what's called scaling agile, disaster. You don't want to do scaling agile. You want to do agile at scale. And I've just shown you how you think about agile at scale. Okay. Thanks for being here. This is a great conversation. This is the first time I've ever presented this. So it was, but I love the questions. All the questions are great. And I'll get this up on the site for you to review. And I think there was a book I said I was going to do, but now I forgot. And I'll also point out our book. If you're interested, let me tell you, let's just get one plug for this. I agree with you. It's dealing with people. One of the things I learned early on when I started success engineering, one of my first workshops was what I called Amplio development. And in Amplio development, in Amplio development, oh, right here, yeah, it was how to convey ideas to people. I kept getting the same questions. They said, Al, this is great. How do I convince anybody? How do I enroll people in this? So all of a sudden I realized, oh my goodness, I was writing a book called Amplio Development. And now all of a sudden really needed what was needed more than the book in Amplio Development. And I'm going to pull up something here to show you. And this is a place for you to work on a little more. What was really needed was a book that would explain how to explain things, because that's tougher. So this is my website. You can go to resources, go to books. And I was writing this book. This book is still in process. Why? Because I ended up thinking this book was more important. This is now on LeanPub. But if you want to, you can go to the book page. Click here to get a commentable copy on Google Docs. Or you can go to LeanPub. I say early version because it's going to have another release in another month. I just wanted to get it out there. I'm going to double the price at that point. But you can upgrade. So if you want to get it now and get an upgrade in a month, that's fine. And you can see I just updated it yesterday. I had an upload problem. Anybody listening here who got the wrong cover, that's because of that, but I fixed that. Anyway, I'll get this up. I'll get some other references. I'm building the foundations page more to give you all the different things we've done over the last several weeks. Next week, I'm going to show how to use a pattern language to make simpler solutions than what you're getting now without them. Okay, there is a way to do it. The quick clue here is just set the defaults. In other words, what if you had the 30 I mentioned for team, just set them to what Scrum does, then teach that. But then when you need to change it, you got the pattern that tells you how. Anyway, thanks for being here. I'll talk to y'all later.
Thank you.